It's going to be the first cycle of lecture, the first lecture by Professor Tomasz Bruce. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce you our colleague, Professor Tomasz Bruce, the professor of the Department of History of Philosophy at the University of Zielona Góra, which is our partner. We have collaborated with this university since 2016, and it is the second visit of Professor Bruce to our faculty, with delivering the cycle of lectures, with a couple of lectures about the history of Polish philosophy and history of Polish culture as well. First of all, I'd like to appreciate you for coming, and I hope this lecture will be fruitful and interesting in our preparation will continue not only in the framework of research preparation, but also in framework of the staff mobility and students' mobility for teaching, especially in case that we have double degree diploma for our PhD students, for our master students in philosophy and political science. So, to make a long story short, I'd like to give the word Professor Tomasz Bruce, please.
And also leave.
Yeah, and also we would
please.
Yeah.
If we should make a lecture over there.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much for this introduction, which was in fact some kind of advertisement, rather. This is a great honor for me to be here and to speak in this wonderful room for the second time. My lecture has a title, as you can see, Polish Philosophy or Philosophy in Poland. So I think that the issue of this lecture is not only regarding Polish philosophy, because originally, some years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I prepared this lecture to be delivered at Vilnius University in Lithuania. I'm sure you know this university. And I think that this lecture is somewhat useful to research, to have some glance at the methods, aims and scopes of researching national traditions in philosophy, especially those national traditions which are not leading, not central in the world of philosophy, but rather as Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian and many others, we are somewhat on the borderlands of the Central European philosophical nations. Okay, so let's start with some introductory remarks. First of all, is it justified to discuss the nationality of philosophy, or its state or political affiliation? It is generally acknowledged that one of the most noble subjects in the study of the history of philosophy is Greek philosophy, isn't it? The same may be said of Roman philosophy. Both are philosophies with a specific cultural, geographical and linguistic background. Yet philosophical questions are generally thought to be universal and equally inspiring, irrespective of the cultural environment of the philosophers who undertake them. What is more problematic, however, is how to refer to the subject examined by historians of Polish philosophy, or philosophy in Poland, or in Lithuania, or in Ukraine. What is their field of research? Is it the history of Polish philosophy, or the history of philosophy in Poland? Is there any difference between these two terms? The present talk will relate to Polish issues, but as I said, this could be to some extent universal and reaching beyond purely Polish problems. The aim of this lecture is to outline this problem of national adjectives attributed to philosophical traditions and to present some attitudes and positions in this discussion on the subject, which began more than a century ago and involved Polish philosophers and historians of philosophy. Some light, hopefully, will be shed on the issue of Polish and any other philosophical tradition. Nevertheless, the story is about Polish traditions, Polish discussions, and Polish philosophers will be involved in this discussion. You will see them. This is the most, in the right time, this is the most sophisticated presentation I have prepared ever. So be ready for some sparks there. Okay, so let's start with some contentious issues. One might reasonably doubt whether Witterol was a Polish philosopher. And let me advertise my tomorrow's lecture about Witterol. Did he speak Polish? We cannot be sure of that. His words were written in Latin. He declared, however, his Polish origins when he said, "In terra nostra scilicet Polonia." And he introduced himself as Thuringorum et Polonorum filius. What about Copernicus? Was he Polish philosopher? To carry out his church responsibilities, Copernicus had to use the help of a translator to speak to the people who spoke Polish, to the people who lived in the area where was his home. His mother tongue was German, but he declared his loyalty to the Polish king. So was he a Polish philosopher or not? Let's take another character, another person. It's Faustus Socinus, a theologian and philosopher of the 16th century. He was Italian-born thinker, a philosopher, who composed his most important works in Poland. And in Poland he found his most devoted students and readers, and in Poland he died. So was he a Polish philosopher or not? And we can consider some closer to us, some closer persons, 19th century philosophers. Let's take Henryk Struve, who will be discussed here in due time, who spent almost all of his life in Warsaw, but his origins were German. And some Polish philosophers said that he cannot properly understand Polish philosophy because his origins were German. But he wrote in Polish, he was teaching in Polish, so what's the problem? Was he a Polish philosopher? And let's take another, the final person in this list, Kazimierz Twardowski. He grew up in Vienna. He taught at Lwów University, which was then at the Austrian rule. He is considered a founder of the original school of philosophy, Lwów Warsaw School. And as a matter of fact, intellectual roots of the school must be sought in the philosophical currents transplanted from Austria and Germany. So we have some contentious issues of various natures which can be related to all of these names which I listed. So, despite such objections, all of the above-mentioned authors, as well as many others, should be included in the broad field of philosophy in Poland. But what about Polish philosophy? What should be considered as a criteria for membership in this category, Polish philosophy or Ukrainian philosophy or any other? Should this philosopher have some kind of Polish character in their writings? Should, one of philosophers said that they should have some Polish color in their writings. But what is it? It's so difficult to define a national character or this national color in someone's writing. So it's difficult to decide which works belong to the field of Polish philosophy and which belong to philosophy in Poland. And let's start with the first picture. Thank you. Okay. Oh, maybe this was a little bit too early, but let it be here. Let's take a look at some other national products of culture. No one will ever doubt the existence of German literature, Italian painting, or French poetry. Therefore, philosophy as a cultural phenomenon can also be qualified with a national adjective. Of course, in listing the philosophies of the European nations, such as English, German, French, and Polish philosophy, we should be under no illusion about the role played by Polish philosophers on the European stage. They certainly did not play a big part. They were not great stars on the philosophical stage in the play entitled European Philosophy. They did not mark many turning points in the history of European philosophy. In the first version, I wanted to say they did not mark any turning points in the history of European philosophy, but once I read it in Poland, many people objected that there were so many turning points by Polish philosophers, so instead of any, I put there many. They did not mark many turning points. Nevertheless, despite their minor role, the philosophical discussions they were engaged in concerned the same issues as those which were under discussion in Western Europe. And let's make a historical overview of philosophy as I see it in a very big picture. Given that philosophy originated in ancient Greece, one can assume that, and one can do it reasonably, that the entire history of philosophy is equivalent to the history of the reception of this ancient invention. Is it? In other words, according to Alfred North Whitehead, you may know these words, he said that history of European philosophy may be regarded as a series of footnotes to whom?
Plato.
To Plato. Yes, to wonderful Plato. And these footnotes have accumulated over the centuries. So they can be, and in fact they have to be, classified and arranged in order to be understood. There are many methods of arranging the rich material of the history of philosophy. Since the methodology of the history of philosophy looks like a battlefield, historians of philosophy make an effort to find their way among the leftovers of the writings, ideas, system, and philosophical currents. And now let's focus on this picture. Very imperfect picture of the history of philosophy. Because history of philosophy, as I can see it, and it's more comprehensible in the tradition which was influenced greatly by the late medieval ages. Because I realized that this picture is even more imperfect when we speak about tradition which draw from Byzantine roots, for example, or from Eastern philosophies. But for now, let's focus on this tree. So, the roots of this tree, which still feed it, are in the Greek and Roman philosophy, so in fact those two roots would be sufficient. Philosophy has Greek origins, and this is an indisputable fact, and contemporary philosophy is still deeply rooted in ancient ideas. And the greatest philosophers of the 20th century and of earlier centuries as well, they discussed, commented, and opposed the great ideas which were born in ancient Greece. If philosophy has its roots in antiquity, then the medieval Latin philosophical culture of Western Europe is certainly this heavy trunk which draws from the substance from the strong ancient radices. Many different branches stem from the trunk. They grow and develop close to each other, but also independently. Modern philosophy splits the apparently homogeneous medieval heritage. Philosophy is transformed from the relative uniformity of scholastic thought and splits into schools, trends, and directions. Their dominance or decline, their rise and fall, determine the division of the history of European philosophy into periods. At the dawn of the modern era, strong national cultures emerged, and national languages overcame the essential unity of medieval philosophical culture, which was based also on the linguistic unity, as in the Middle Ages, as we all know, philosophy was done in Latin. The divisions and periods in the history of philosophy are continuously interwoven with geographical and chronological characteristics. Ancient European philosophy is split traditionally into Greek and Roman, two cultures and two periods of dominance. The significant national characteristic passed the philosophy of the Middle Ages by. There are geographical characteristics of the philosophical schools or currents of that time, but they are not national. For the historians of medieval philosophy talk about Parisian or Oxford scholasticism. It was not until the beginning of modernity that philosophy started to be systematized in national terms. We have all heard about Italian Renaissance philosophy, which emerged in a different place and at a different time than the English Renaissance, not to mention Polish Renaissance. What is far more important, however, that all these renaissances differed from each other, each of them bearing the distinguishing mark of their times and places and their languages. The same can be said about the Enlightenment and also about German, Polish or American, for example, Hegelianism. What then makes philosophy national? What is the subject of research of all of these philosophers and historians of philosophy who say that they pursue history of Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian or Russian philosophy? It may be worthwhile now to quote some arguments produced by Polish philosophers and historians of philosophy. Let us now ask the wise men and one woman among them, and we will see what they have to say to us. The discussion on the concept of Polish philosophy could not emerge earlier than the first generation of modern historians of philosophy and historians of Polish philosophy appeared. Some names and opinions will be presented now, and their purpose is to present the rich material, including questions and problems which were and are still faced by historians of national philosophies. So, let's start with the first one. Hendrik Struve, whom I mentioned before. He was a philosopher, logician, historian of philosophy and logic. He was born in Poland, in Warsaw, but he died in England because when he retired, he moved to his daughter, who lived near London, and he died there. For over 40 years, so it's quite a long passage of time, he lectured at the Imperial Russian University of Warsaw. And in the year 1900, he published a book which has a very long title, The History of Philosophy in Poland Against the Background of the Universal Development of Intellectual Life. Very long title. Since Struve decided to write the history of philosophy in Poland, it meant that Polish philosophers had already made some progress in this field, especially, as Struve argued, in the 19th century. But let me stress it once again. The term used in this title is history of philosophy in Poland, not the history of Polish philosophy. And he realized that these terms, they constitute some problem. And he argued for the aptness of this term, history of philosophy in Poland, as follows. He said, Polish philosophy, as well as Polish language and Polish literature, indicates that we are referring to the direct product of the Polish nation, which is owned by its spirit, which originated and developed by intellects born from its bosom. Polish philosophy means the same as the philosophy of the Poles. Well, there is no doubt that in some ways we can talk about the philosophy of the Poles, as well as that every individual and every nation has its own philosophy. If we mean by this, by philosophy, an overall view of the world and life. Struve concluded that such a broad concept of philosophy could in fact be replaced by the concept of Polish culture. And that would be wrong, he said, because philosophy is the highest manifestation of culture, but only this philosophy which is taken in a proper, narrow meaning. And for him, it was a result of critical thought and scientific tendencies. Struve, however, mentioned English, French, or German philosophies after Greek and Indian philosophies. He didn't speak about philosophy in Germany or philosophy in France. He said there is something like English, German, and French philosophy. So the question arises, what is difference in the works of Polish philosophers, since they did not contribute to Polish philosophy, whereas English philosophers produced English philosophy, and not only philosophy in England. And Struve's answer is following. National philosophy's genesis must result from the national culture. If it does not, then it is just a philosophy in a given country, and not the philosophy of the nation dwelling in this country. Struve associated philosophy with a national character, as he stated that the original English philosophy began with Francis Bacon. Before him, only philosophy in England existed. Along with Bacon, English philosophy started in England, and its orientation remains essentially empirical. The same applies, Struve says, to French philosophy, which starts with René Descartes, who gave this philosophy a rationalist character. German philosophy did not exist before Leibniz, and its main area of interest is metaphysics. So he found some peculiarities of national philosophies, but he did not find them in Polish philosophy. But at the end of his introduction, we find some light in the tunnel, because he says that finally, in the 19th century, Polish philosophy is struggling for independence. And in the 19th century, finally, some independence was gained, and maybe, Struve says, we can speak of Polish philosophy in the 19th century, but let's not go too far. Let's be cautious and speak about philosophy in Poland. Let's move to the next historian. This is a very little known figure, Stanisław Garfa-Ingarski. I could not find his pictures. This is a very significant thesis, isn't it? Truths valid for one nation only cannot exist. Stanisław Garfań-Garski, he criticized Struve in his lecture on the issue of Polish national philosophy. He faced a very similar problem as Struve, and he said, the matter which is under our consideration seems at first glance to be paradoxical. For how can one combine philosophy or science, the most universal manifestations of culture, with something totally particular, with nationality? So how can you do this? How can you combine them together? And this is the conclusion of his paper. Truths valid for one nation cannot exist, because according to Garfań-Garski, there is only one field of philosophical reflection which can have a significant national character, and this is philosophy of history. Philosophy of history, historiosophy, right? The reflection on the history of this given nation, which is different from the other nations. And only in this area, says Garfań-Garski, we can search for some national peculiarities in philosophy. And he also remarked something very significant, which is, I think, important and valid even today. Because he said, I think this was something like a warning for the historians of Polish philosophy and for the historians of philosophy in general. He said, we are intensively occupied with philosophy from all around the world, and our own philosophy is almost a barren land. So, not many people focus on the issue of very intellectual philosophical traditions. And this is, I think, still valid remark. Kazimierz Twardowski. As you know, this is one of the most important figures in Polish philosophy of the 20th century. And Twardowski, I think to some extent, he had more broad intellectual horizons than many of his disciples, than many of his students. And he observed native, local philosophical aspirations, though they appeared to him weak. But he wanted to reconcile and combine them with foreign influences. Foreign inspirations should be, however, according to Twardowski, drawn from diverse traditions, in order not to become one-sided. So, he said, none of the foreign philosophies will be able to invade the area of native Polish philosophy, but all of them will fertilize the soil on which the native philosophy will grow up luxuriantly. In other texts, Twardowski voiced the need to organize a bibliographical listing of Polish philosophical works and to set up one central catalogue of philosophical works available in Polish libraries. So what he called for was a very basic, fundamental work in history, to start the history of philosophy. And he has expressed an opinion very similar to that of Garfań-Garski when he said, we have, in fact, much richer philosophical achievements than one might think. We neither use them properly in philosophical research nor in teaching philosophy, and we do not use them because simply we do not know them. So to use your philosophy, the philosophy of your national tradition, you have to first learn it. You have to find the thinkers, find the works, search the libraries, search the archives. Let's move to another historian of philosophy, Adam Zieleńczyk. He was also a philosopher, and he pointed out the double genealogy of the concept Polish philosophy. On one hand, Polish philosophy is in fact philosophy as such, philosophy in general. Nevertheless, Polish philosophy is also Polish, local, so to a certain extent, it has some specific features. Therefore, he says, the term of Polish philosophy is not equal to the general term of philosophy in Poland, but it is not an exclusive concept of the philosophy of the Polish people, since it has features of universal philosophy combined with these unique features given to this science by Polish intellect. And he continued, philosophy has to strive for the truth and must not abandon this path once chosen for any national reasons. It would be better for philosophy not to be national as you can see there, rather than to become false. So the nationality of philosophy is an issue of secondary importance. Truth is the most important for philosophers. Another philosopher, Roman Ingarden, a very famous figure, disciple of Edmund Husserl, also expressed his views on national philosophy. He first studied mathematics in philosophy in Lwów under Twardowski. When he moved to Göttingen, he was considered by Husserl to be one of his best students, and in 1918, Ingarden submitted his doctoral dissertation with Husserl as its supervisor. Ingarden's opinion was expressed briefly yet clearly. First, he criticized the popular and professional meaning of philosophy. He said, philosophy is considered as something significantly associated with one mental structure or another, as an expression of this or that individual attitude towards the world. Some even talk of national philosophy. They call to establish it, just like with equal rightness one could speak of national mathematics or national zoology. So, if philosophy should be considered as a science, as Ingarden says, so we cannot put any national objectives to philosophy. The next one, the next thinker, Bolesław Gawecki, who was an apologist of Polish Romantic tradition, he took the floor and he argued in favor of the use of the term Polish philosophy. According to Gawecki, the term is justified by the fact that Poles have rendered considerable services to this field, and they applied unique, original methods to this science. And lastly, they gave it a distinct character and form with Polish national characteristics. Anyway, Polish philosophy would be, regarding its content, universal philosophy, says Gawecki. Well, this is a clear response to Ingarden's attempt to ridicule national philosophy. And Gawecki says, Ingarden could have been right, provided that philosophy is a regular science like all the others. But in Gawecki's opinion, it is not. Philosophy is not an ordinary science, for philosophical theses are not usually intersubjectively verifiable, and their synthetic nature provides philosophy a unique place among sciences and in culture in general. So much then for the period before the Second War. All the above opinions originated in the period when Polish philosophers were attempting to free themselves from the influence of the decades of messianic and romantic tradition. Most of them, especially the younger generation, were trying to step out of the shadows of 19th century thought. They aimed to produce modern philosophy like all the other nations had. But still, the old tradition remained alive, and in fact, the above-quoted participants of the discussion were unable to distinguish controversial issues from the history of philosophy from the calls and demands of the future development of philosophy. The situation changed after the war, when historians of philosophy systematically attempted to research their own philosophical intellectual tradition, and in fact, Marxist philosophy, to some extent, supported such research. One of the most important events in this development was the publication of the two-volume History of Polish Philosophy by Wiktor Wąsik. Wiktor Wąsik, this was a figure who was really unlucky in his life because his son died during the war, and also the manuscript of his two volumes of the History of Philosophy were burned and destroyed by Germans, but he wrote it once again. He simply wrote it once again. In the introduction to his work, this Polish researcher attempted to explain his desire to break with the tradition of regarding philosophical work of Poles as philosophy in Poland, because Wąsik claimed that national color had existed in Polish philosophy since the Middle Ages, although he was aware that it had not been too clear, but in the course of time it had grown stronger and stronger. Following the previous discussion and Wąsik's considerations, one can draw some terminological conclusions which allow us to systematize the results of the foregoing controversy. And we have 3 points there under Wąsik's photo, 3 points and 3 terms and 3 definitions. The most general term is without doubt philosophy in Poland. It encompasses all the phenomena of philosophy in Polish culture. When medieval philosophy is concerned, there appears to have been almost no uniquely Polish content, apart from geographical reference to Poland. It is not until the Renaissance era that it is possible to talk about special features of Polish thought and to introduce the second concept, that is Polish philosophy, which starts during the Renaissance. It is only then that a certain independence of Polish philosophers can be observed, and some national and local elements come to the fore, revealing the specificity of the Polish Renaissance and thus of Polish philosophy. However, this is only a certain local cultural specificity of an intellectual current engulfing the whole of Europe. Therefore, besides the history of philosophy in Poland and history of Polish philosophy, one more phenomenon appears in Polish culture, and this is point 3 on this picture. This is Polish national philosophy. This is a special Polish phenomenon, Wąsik says, in the 19th century, which is also referred as philosophy of nation, of philosophy of Polish national messianism. This third phenomenon is an intensification of Polish philosophy growing to its highest degree, in which the national element had been strongly accumulated. Thus, empiricism is generally considered a distinguishing mark of British philosophy, 19th century idealism of German philosophy. And we can also label, as Wąsik says, Polish philosophy with messianism of the 19th century, and Polish philosophy, Polish national philosophy, can be described as a philosophy of philosophical national messianism. After Wąsik, the discussion on the content and on the methods of researching history of Polish philosophy, because as you have noticed, we haven't been talking about the methods for the time being, because historians of philosophy only advised to do some fundamental research libraries, do the catalogs and bibliographies and so on and so on. But in the late 60s of the 20th century, philosophers and historians of philosophy started to produce, to articulate some methodological remarks, methodological instructions. And the first of them was Józef Bańka. Józef Bańka, when I prepared this lecture some years ago, he was still alive, but he died about a month ago. He was one of my teachers, and this is how I remember him. This is his office at the Silesian University in Katowice. Bańka said that in Polish historiography of Polish philosophy, there is one feature missing, because most of the time Polish philosophy is represented like an international phenomenon which is progressive, or as a national philosophy which is obscure, reactionary and fideist. And he called to re-evaluate this fideist philosophy and to re-evaluate this national sign, national color, this national character of Polish philosophy by presenting it as progressive, as national and progressive at the same time. This was quite a difficult task, and in fact he expressed this task in a review of a book on history of Polish philosophy, which he did not like much. He did not like the book. He loved Polish philosophy, but not this book on Polish philosophy. And this discussion developed and flourished when Andrzej Walicki, the next historian of philosophy, who is still alive, as you can see, when Andrzej Walicki organized a dispute in Warsaw. He invited historians of philosophy and philosophers and allowed them to express freely what they think about his proposal of researching history of Polish philosophy, and what his proposal is, I will tell you in a minute. He is the historian of Polish and Russian philosophy. He is recognized in the West. For many years he lectured history of Russian philosophy in American universities, and many of his books were published in English, and some of them also in Russian. I don't know about any Ukrainian translation of Walicki's works, but maybe there is one. So he defended the purposefulness of historical studies on Polish philosophy which do not disregard its relation with European culture, and at the same time avoid reducing Polish philosophy to a mere series of philosophical influences. Walicki says, history of Polish philosophy should not be studied on the margins of the general history of philosophy. The methods applied by a historian to investigate philosophy as an intellectual biography of a nation differ from the methods applied by a researcher of the universal history of philosophical problems. Walicki intended to revise the opinion on the non-autonomous character of the history of Polish philosophy and its dependence on Western thought. He said, history of Polish philosophy should be distinguished from the general history of philosophy and should be established as an independent discipline, not as a subordinate of the general history of philosophy, but its coordinate. And this could be achieved only by separating the history of Polish philosophy from the general history of philosophy in terms of scope and method. For, on the one hand, history of Polish and any other national philosophy is a part of the global history of philosophy, but on the other hand, it constitutes a part of the history of Polish culture, of Polish intellectual history. And to encourage his colleagues to take up the study of their native philosophy, he said, to study Polish philosophy, all the responsibility lies with us. This is our duty to take care of these studies, their completeness and balance. We can meet our needs in the field of the general history of philosophy with suitably selected translations, but the gaps in our knowledge of Polish philosophy can be filled up only by our own research. So nobody will do it for us. This is Walicki's argument. Egyptians will not come to Poland or to Ukraine to do the Ukrainian philosophy. You have to do it yourself, and we have to do it by ourselves. Nobody else can do it, but the most important point in Walicki's first voice on this issue is that the history of national philosophy should be reflected against two backgrounds: the history of general philosophy, of the world's philosophy, and the history of national culture. It is somehow on the border between these two fields of studies. And his proposal was published in the most important journal of this time, Philosophical Studies, and in subsequent issues of Philosophical Studies, some opinions of the most eminent Polish historians of philosophy were expressed as well. This is Jan Legowicz, historian of medieval philosophy. He confirmed the validity of the methodological demands made by Walicki. Especially, he liked the remark on the interdisciplinary nature of research on the history of Polish philosophy. Legowicz, as a specialist in the history of medieval philosophy, insisted on taking up starting steps, and the starting step is to undertake rudimentary archival and library research. And he was the head of the historians of medieval philosophy in Polish Academy of Sciences. He had a team of scholars, and what they did in the 60s and in the 70s was that they researched, I think, all the libraries in Poland to index all the philosophical texts which originated in Middle Ages and later. They had access not only to the lay libraries, to the state libraries, but also to the church libraries, and this is a very fruitful and wonderful job that they did. So, as a scholar specializing, should I finish? As a scholar specializing in medieval philosophy, Legowicz stresses the necessity to research libraries and archives. The next one was Władysław Tatarkiewicz. This is the figure which you probably know, because I know that his 3 volumes of History of Philosophy are available in Ukrainian, and this is not only my opinion and not only the opinion of Polish researchers, but this is quite a general opinion that this is one of the best histories of philosophy, which originated in the first half of the 20th century. This is, okay, I will talk about Tatarkiewicz next week, so just a few remarks. Tatarkiewicz, as a historian of philosophy with great experience, as a historian of philosophy writing with a great style, with experience in researching, writing, publishing and lecturing history of philosophy, he tried to calm down the initial enthusiasm. He considered a number of demands to be exaggerated. For example, he did not believe that the demand to treat the history of philosophy as a separate field of study was sufficiently justified. Another personality, Tadeusz Kotarbiński. He was a student of Twardowski in Lwów, a philosopher and a logician, and one of the most important representatives of the Lwów Warsaw School. He responded positively to the idea of treating the history of Polish philosophy as a part of Polish history and Polish intellectual culture. But he added, however, an essential remark on the field of philosophy which interested him the most. He says, "We must remember, however, that the history of Polish logic requires a different treatment, especially the recent mathematizing formal logic, and this is due both to the nature of logic as well to the global position of Polish logic." The next historian of philosophy, Stefan Zwierzawski. As you can see, he lived for almost 100 years, and he left numerous works on medieval philosophy, but also on the philosophy of the 15th century and of the 16th century as well, which he considered as some transformatory period from the medieval ages to modern philosophy, and this period was for him the most interesting. He also left a large book which was edited after his death by his students, The History of European Classical Philosophy, which is really a huge volume, and it is very often used for teaching even today. But his basic specialty is philosophy of the Middle Ages. He came up with an important methodological pointer which was not quite in line with Walicki's thesis. Zwierzawski focused on the concept of philosophy itself and on the fact that throughout the centuries its content had been changed. Therefore, he regarded the proposal to integrate research on the history of Polish philosophy and on the history of Polish national culture as risky. He said, "It seems to be dangerous and methodologically incorrect to mix the two different and distinct types of historical sciences. The threat for historical research, according to Zwierzawski, was that the combination of strictly philosophical issues with these belonging to broader philosophical, cultural and social background might result in a redefinition of the scope of the history of philosophy." And he, okay, this should be all for Zwierzawski. So he expressed some caveats about this Walicki's postulate to treat this issue of history of Polish philosophy as interdisciplinary study. The next historian of philosophy, finally, among those men, we have a historian of French philosophy and also a historian of Polish philosophy of the 19th century, especially of these trends which were connected to positivism, pre-positivism, and so on. She developed some of Walicki's initial thesis. She managed to start her study in Vilnius in the pre-war period, and then she was moved by the Soviet regime to Siberia, and only in the 50s she returned to Poland. And in some respects she was, it could be said, I don't know if the right word, she was delayed compared to her peers, because she lost her best years, which could be devoted to the study of philosophy or anything else. But when she arrived in Poland, she quickly made up with them, and she became one of the leading figures of Polish philosophy and history of philosophy. She said something very interesting for our current issue, because she suggested a new term. Instead of Polish philosophy and history of Polish philosophy, she suggested a term, history of history of philosophical culture in Poland, or Polish intellectual history. The argument for this methodological approach was, first of all, the scope of the research field. She says, this discipline is rather interested in what can be called philosophical thinking or an outlook on life, that is, a structure which consists of ethical and religious values, as well as social and political beliefs and philosophical views. But the latter do not play the autonomous role. They are a sort of cement that holds the varied content in a reasonable unity. According to Skarga, the Marxist method of historiography rendered services to the history of Polish philosophy. And another quote, she says, even little-known phenomena, not arousing any curiosity, appeared in a different light. Human thoughts ceased to be suspended in a social void. Thus, apparently trivial worldviews, when considered today with their social functions, have taken on new and unexpected values. And at the final phrases of her speech referred to the notion of patriotism. What is a patriotism? A patriotic historian of Polish philosophy is not someone who falls into megalomania, who says that there is nothing better than Polish philosophy and nothing else should be done. True patriotism, according to Skarga, should be measured only with diligence, with responsibility for one's good work. Only good work is a true patriotism. This is what he said. So work diligently, and this is patriotism, not to fall into national megalomania. We're coming slowly to an end of this list. Zbigniew Kuderowicz, another historian of philosophy, first of all of German philosophy, but also of Polish philosophy of the 19th century. Let's move quickly to this quote. He says that history of Polish philosophy has to remain the history of philosophy, but has to use material not only of a philosophical nature. What does it mean? It is a very important remark, because he says that to present national philosophy, you cannot focus only on this phenomena which originated at universities, in academia. Not only academic works are the material for the historian of national philosophy. He should read novels, read economical works, read scientific works, read historians' production to reconstruct the history of philosophy in his own tradition. So problems are philosophical, and historian of philosophy should focus on these philosophical problems, but he should look for them in not only philosophical material. And the final scholar on our list is Ryszard Palacz. On this picture, what an accident, he is there with me. About 10 or 15 years ago. He was also one of the specialists in medieval philosophy, and he was one of the figures in the team of Jan Legowicz. Well, the point that he stressed in his voice in this discussion, which was in fact the final voice, is that he argued that the ethnic criteria in the history of philosophy, in Polish philosophy, should be abolished. Because if they are not, then we will overlook foreign philosophers who are active and influential in Poland. And one of them I mentioned today, which is, for example, Faustus Socinus. So, as you can see, many voices appeared in this discussion. Some agreed with this interdisciplinary character of researching national philosophy, and some disagreed with it. What is, however, important is the fact that Walicki, who started this discussion, he also agreed to give the final word of this discussion. And I'd like to quote a long passage from the summary of this discussion, because in the summary he stressed even more some of his initial theses, and he also referred to the voices of his opponents. And we can show the final slide. conclusions and a piece of practical advice. So we are very soon reaching the end. Walицki's final statement is, I believe, however, that for the sake of the history of Polish philosophy, it was worth to put the emphasis on the fact that this is a typical interdisciplinary area, and not just a part of any of the existing and institutionalized disciplines. Moreover, it appears to me that the specific developments in the history of Polish philosophy can only be recognized when we consider them as a branch of the Polish culture and particular aspect of the intellectual history of the Polish nation. Such a treatment brings to light the significance of a number of phenomena which are of little importance, if any, from the point of view of the general history of philosophical problems. So, any little figure of a philosopher who is insignificant in the history of world philosophy, he can be very influential and very important when the national history of philosophy is researched. It may also be worth noting that with the appropriate approach to such research, the danger of closing within one's own fences does not appear. After all, Polish culture and what is called the intellectual history of Poland must also be considered in a broad international comparative context. Personally, I think that this context would have to include much more than just philosophy, but the whole of the essential ideological phenomena in the culture of every era, so that the field of comparative research would be much wider than that of the universal history of philosophy in the traditional sense. So, he wants to go further than the history of philosophy in a traditional sense. He wants to re-evaluate some small phenomena in this or that little national philosophical tradition. And from the perspective of the decades that passed, over half a century that passed from this discussion, I have to say that he, his disciples, and also other historians of Polish philosophy who applied this methodological advice, they produced very valuable fruits in the field of the history of national philosophy. And indeed, the most important effect and result of this discussion is the fact that history of Polish philosophy stopped to be in Poland treated as a subject of secondary importance. Because some people thought that research on the history of Polish philosophy is done only by the people who, for example, know known foreign languages, right? So they focus only on Polish works. But what about the historians of medieval philosophy? In Poland? What about the historians of Renaissance philosophy in Poland, which was very often done in Latin? What about the historians of the Jesuit philosophy in Poland, which was done in Latin until the 19th century? What about the historians of German influences? What about the historians of Russian influences on Polish philosophy? They all had to learn many languages. Maybe not many, but at least some. And this shows that some of Walицki's postulates were realized and fulfilled. And we are very happy about it. For example, right now in Poland we have 2 journals devoted to the history of Polish philosophy. And also many special issues of other journals appear which are devoted to the history of Polish philosophy only. We have a yearly seminar of the history of Polish philosophy, which is very often attended by guests from abroad, from Ukraine as well. So much for the conclusions, but what about practical advice? From this long discussion, this is a piece of my practical advice, which is based on practice, but also on some discussions with my colleagues. First of all, I think that everyone who wants to research their own national tradition in philosophy should consider minor authors. Naturally, those in the top international philosophical league seem to be the most attractive, right? Isn't it more attractive to do research on Kant or Hegel or Bertrand Russell than to research some works of
writer who was a little bit philosophical, but not only philosophical, how to render his works in the field of philosophy. This is really difficult. And these names of the great European philosophers are attractive, but there will be a number of studies devoted to them. So another piece of advice is, isn't it better to do a pioneering work on a little known figure than write a 10,000 study on Hegel or Kant or whoever else? Okay. And one more point, search for material outside the works traditionally considered as philosophical. Study the literature, study poetry, go beyond classifications. Philosophy and philosophical problems can be found almost everywhere in human production. For example, the School of Athens. You can read a lot of philosophy in this picture. If you don't know how to do this, so I suggest you to read the book of Giovanni Reale, which is devoted only to this picture. He sees so many philosophy in there. There is so much to do, not only in the works written, but also in the painted works. But we have something more what 19th century didn't have. We have movies, we have new media, and this all can be a material for a historian of national philosophy to be researched. Usually, I finish this lecture with a quote by an American philosopher who learned Polish in order, something unusual, right? American philosopher who learns Polish to read the Warsaw School works. But I decided that, some time ago, I decided that this is not really accurate to do this, because when I finished this lecture with words by American, this looks like we still feel to be some kind of parochial philosophy of minor importance. We are like a peasant in a village who feel to be noticed by the Lord driving on the street. So, but when I mentioned him, maybe I should quote him. Shall I? His name is Barry Smith. Okay, so let me quote him, but with all these caveats I made. Just as the term Austrian philosophy is a misnomer, a bad name, a misleading name, to the degree that it suggests that there is a corresponding national or regional or ethnic philosophy or a special Austrian way of doing philosophy that is unavailable to those born outside the borders of the Habsburg Empire. And just as the term women's philosophy is a misnomer to the extent that it suggests that there is a special way of doing philosophy that is available only to those of feminine gender. So also the term Polish philosophy is a misnomer, and just for the same reasons. For Polish philosophy is philosophy per se. It is a part and parcel of the mainstream of world philosophy simply because it meets international standards of training, rigor, professionalism, and specialization, and so on and so on. But when we in Poland quote this, and this happens quite often, I think that this is just a symptom of some inferiority complex. Therefore, let's treat my lecture as I haven't had quoted as far as words. Thank you very much. We have momentary questions.
Thank you. A very great lecture. My question is about interrelation between Polish philosophy and Polish language. Because, for example, in German philosophy there is a long history of interrelation. The philosophers in 19th and 20th century thought that German language is better for philosophy than others. So, is there some maybe historical or current issues connected to Polish language and the way of doing philosophy in Polish language? Thank you.
Well, you mentioned the German philosophy. Of course, Germans consider German language to be the best philosophical language, maybe after the Greek. Right? This was also, if I'm not mistaken, the opinion of Heidegger. In 19th century, let me refer to one special case of this dispute about languages. In the University of Wrocław, in the 19th century, there was a large Polish minority, but the lecturers most of the time were German. And one of these German lecturers said that Slavic people would never impact on the history of Europe because the declension of a noun in Polish and in other languages is very complicated. So he said, only those nations that have languages with 3 or maximum 4, right? Przypadki? I don't know this word. Cases. So 3 or 4 maximum cases allow the nation to impact the history, to do something significant, right? And what happened to this philosopher? He was called for a pojedynek? Once again, pojedynek, to fight for guns. Duel. Another one. Thank you. So he was called for a duel by Polish students who didn't agree with this thesis. And since he agreed on this duel and did not appear when the duel was to take place, he was fired by the university authorities. And this was a very famous story how languages can translate into the leading, into the role in the history of Europe. So this was not a very common view. But today in Poland, are there any studies on Polish language? Of course, analytical tradition, which is strong in Poland, of course, is based on some philosophical linguistic research. But these philosophers, most of the time, they are strongly attached to English language. Although some attempts appear to, how to call it, I would say the closest terms would be to find philosophical etymologies of Polish words. And in this respect, I know one, I'm not sure if everyone would agree with it, because there is a lot of creativity in this work, maybe more creativity than historical etymological research. But there is one work of Jacek Juliusz Jadacki, who considers himself to be the heir of Lwów Warsaw School. So he researches Polish language as a philosophical language, which is very suitable to do philosophy on the basis of his philosophical etymological research. I can email you this.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have one. While we are thinking, I have one question. We have discussed a lot these issues together more, but I'm interested. So when I listened, I came to the conclusion that we could count that history of philosophy and history of national philosophy is not the branch of philosophy, it's the branch of cultural studies. So what is your attitude to this idea? So historian of philosopher, he's not doing the philosophy, he's doing cultural studies. According to what you said.
Well, the answer could be the only one. Yes, but.
We are not philosophers.
Yes, because this is the conclusion to which I adhere. Yes, because the material cannot be only philosophical, but not because the historian of philosophy should search for philosophical problems, philosophical solutions, philosophical background, and philosophical background in writers, painters, and all the others who create culture. So yes, but.
So we can encourage our cultural studies students to research in the history of philosophy as well. Okay, thank you.
They should have some set of philosophical concepts, set of philosophical ideas or problems, and with this set they should read novels, scientific works, historical works, and so on.
Because in Ukraine we tend to think that history of Ukrainian philosophy is cultural studies more than philosophy. Because you can see that the history of Ukraine is a part of the culture, it is the mainstream and the main topic and the main branch and scope of this research, this kind of research. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Professor.
You mentioned about the painting, and I think, are there any relations between artificial intelligence and national philosophy? Artificial intelligence is also language, and somebody creates this language or creates. What do you think about it? As a spatial language. Are there any spatial language for non-national history of philosophy?
Logicians would
Yes,
say
one of them.
that there is a language of logic,
Yeah.
which is universal. But is it suitable to do the history of philosophy with this language? For example, there are many papers, maybe you know the Plato's dialogue Theaetetus. There are very important logical and epistemological issues researched in this dialogue. Or another example, Ratio Anselmi. Anselm of Canterbury proof for the existence of God, though the word proof is maybe not the argument for the existence of God. Logicians try to formalize their reasonings, Plato's reasoning and Anselm's reasoning, and they can present them in the form of logical symbols, right? And what is their conclusion? That Plato and Anselm, they think in a wrong way, they make errors, so there's no use to read their works. But is it still the history of philosophy? Because when you try to put these complex philosophical issues, which is painted on a background, this Anselm's argument cannot be read without the preface to Proslogion. Plato's arguments cannot be read outside the entire dialogue. So when you extract it from the entire text, something ridiculous appears. Just one fallacy. And logicians, maybe they would say that this entire literary context of beautiful Plato's work is just a robe to cover a logical fallacy. So, is the language of logic suitable to research the history of philosophy? As the only instrument, I would say no.
Yes, but. Yes, it's a culture.
Let me refer to one special case in this respect, which is quite funny. Maybe you know, or maybe not, the Polish writer and movie maker Stefan Temerson. You may not have heard about him. He is an important figure in Polish philosophy because he knew Bertrand Russell. Yes. And he would, after the war, on the way via France, he moved to England, he met Russell, and they cooperated. He had a very small publishing house, and he published Russell's work, which is, the title is History of the World in Epitome. And this History of the World in Epitome is just one page, one sentence, which says, after Adam and Eve left the paradise, everything went wrong. The end. And he wrote also a novel, which title is Cardinal Polatuo or Polatuto with an umlaut on every vowel. And in this novel we have a cardinal who is an enemy of Bertrand Russell. And this cardinal wants to Christianize analytic philosophers, which were most of the times atheists. And during his long life, he thinks about the language which could be used for analytical philosophers to make them accept the Christian message, right? Because his reasoning is like this. Christian missionaries learned the languages of the Indians and made them Christian. Christian missionaries learned the languages of the black people in Africa and made them Christians. Christian missionaries learned the languages of Asian people and made them Christians. right? So maybe Christian missionaries should learn the language of analytical logic, of analytical philosophy, and make all those philosophers Christians. And unfortunately, he fails.
I know one of the PhD program students who do it. But does it? Really? It's really true. As a spatial research. And Senior
We could try to launch this research in the future. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much for this first lecture. Thank you once again.
Thank you for your patience.
And I want to invite our colleagues and students for the other lectures, which will be delivered tomorrow and on the next week at the same time. If you don't know this time, if you forget this time, you can find it in our Facebook page for our faculty.
Can I say a short word?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to advertise in tomorrow's lectures on Vitero. I will speak about demons, sex, unusual sexual behaviors. So please come. I prepare another presentation.
And a special
This slide.